I found myself sort of maybe 15 years down the line, whatever it'd be, with 2 published books, a publisher telling me, yeah, go for it, go for another one. And suddenly that imposter syndrome that I've just been talking about had really been chipped away at. And I just thought, can I do it? Can I be the one to do it? I didn't feel like anybody cared, could possibly care more than me about the story of the Bulldogs. As I say, it had gone on 2 decades now of my fandom, and my obsession's probably a bit strong at that point. It turned into an obsession, but inclination with the story and following the story all that time. And yeah, I just decided I sort of got a burst of confidence. I thought I can do it, and I think I'm the right person to do it. And it couldn't possibly have gone much better, really.
Hello and welcome to the Good Journeys with Second Mountain podcast. I'm your host, Ben Veal, founder of Second Mountain, Meaningful Comms for a Brave New World. And this is the show that shines a spotlight on inspiring people and their inspired stories. Please join in the conversation with us on social media using the hashtag GoodJourneysPod. And you can also find each and every episode in full over at our YouTube channel. Just search for @Second Mountain Comms. Joining me on today's show is my special guest, Stephen Bell, the author of Dynamite Davey. Stephen specialises in drawing out some of the fascinating and untold stories from the worlds of sports and entertainment. With 3 published books to his name already, all of which have been very well received, his latest book, recently published by Pitch Publishing, has been described as a love letter to arguably the 2 greatest British wrestlers of all time. Dynamite Davey, The Explosive Lives of the British Bulldogs, charts the incredible story of the Dynamite Kid Tom Billington and the British Bulldog Davey Boy Smith. And what a story it is. With a foreword from the pair's brother-in-law Ross Hart and a touching afterword from the Dynamite Kid's daughter Bronwyn Billington, it's already been favourably compared by many within the industry as one of the best books ever written on the world of professional wrestling. Stephen, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm great, Ben. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And what an introduction. Thank you very much.
Well, it's my pleasure. And, I absolutely adored the book, first and foremost. What I want to ask is, when you hear an introduction like that, how does that make you feel as an author?
Obviously very proud, a little less embarrassed than it would have done 6 months ago. I might not have got one of them introductions 6 months ago, but I had a bit of imposter syndrome for a while. I'm a sort of 5 years into this writing journey now. It was something that I decided to do just for my own dreams and targets, really. And I was suffering with some anxiety at the time, and I decided to channel that in a positive way. And when I did that, and I stumbled across these amazing sporting stories that I wanted to tell people about, rather than telling a few mates in a pub, I thought, why not try and write a book? It was something that I'd always felt I'd got a bit of a talent for. I've got friends who were professional footballers or musicians, and them sort of things, sport and music, as much as I love them, it was never on my radar. Never felt I'd got a talent for it. Never had the sort of hand-eye coordination or the musical ear. But yeah, I got A stars in English at school, and I always had this sort of obsession with telling stories and things. And even though I went down an engineering route as my primary career, I decided to really have a go at this first and foremost as an hobby, not really knowing where it was going to take me. And yeah, we are 3 published books later. It's been a roller coaster ride, and yeah, this one's been received so well by some really lofty people, particularly in the world of professional wrestling. 2 or 3 of them very much childhood heroes of my own, which is very surreal and humbling. But yeah, that imposter syndrome's sort of going away a little bit now, I'm glad to say, and it feels like I'm where I need to be.
Good. I think, imposter syndrome affects us all, and I think it's very difficult to overcome, but you should be really proud of the book that you've pulled together here. So let's kick off with Dynamite Davey. Why don't you talk me through what the journey was like for you to write this book? Like, how did this idea first come to you? Where did you begin? And I guess what I'm really interested in is, why did you feel that you were the right person to tell the story of the British Bulldogs?
Well, I was a child wrestling fan. I think myself and you have discussed this sort of casually before. We're a very similar age, and it was difficult as a young boy in the UK in the sort of early 90s not to be completely enamoured with the WWF as it was at the time. They'd done that deal with Sky TV. It were getting sort of piped into everybody's living rooms. It felt fresh and new and vibrant, and we were all sort of obsessed with it as kids. And then a second wave of fandom came when I was a teenager, and it was the Attitude Era as it was. And uh, for sort of the second time in my young life, I was Vince McMahon's target demographic that time as a teenager, and so I was Davey Boy Smith, the British Bulldog, was one of the probably only him and the Undertaker within the WWF, particularly, that sort of transcended those two eras. So I knew of Davey's story, and then as I became more and more obsessed with the inner workings of wrestling, and I found that side of it even more interesting than what I was watching on screen. I started reading the wrestlers' autobiographies that were coming out. Mick Foley's was a true eye opener for me. I thought it was an amazing book, one of the best I'd read at the time, sort of 16, 17 years old. He spoke about both Bulldogs quite at length in that, and by then I'd learned that just through the internet and magazines, I'd learned that they were first cousins. I thought that added another dynamic to the story. I'd heard that they were from Wigan, a mining town, just a mining village of Golborne, just like my hometown of Featherstone. So I felt like I'd got this shared heritage with them. So suddenly Davy Boy had gone from being this larger than life character hero of mine as a child to somebody who I felt I could relate to, and then out of nowhere he died. Which, you know, certain people that I think everybody's got on the list where you think, I know exactly where I was when I heard that news. I remember exactly where I was when I heard that news that David Boy
me too.
had died. And so, yeah, the time went on. Brett's book came out. Brett's book probably just nipped in front of Mick's as my favourite wrestling book. Absolutely loved it. Obviously, Brett talks about the Bulldogs an awful lot. That put a lot more meat on the bones. But my writing journey still hadn't begun at that point. I had no idea. If anything, I probably thought it back in mind that eventually somebody would do this book, or a real in-depth documentary might come out about it all. And it just never did. And then I found myself sort of maybe 15 years down the line, whatever it'd be, with two published books, a publisher telling me, yeah, go for it, go for another one. And my second book had featured on the front page of national newspapers because it opened the door to a war story. So some national newspapers ran with it as their 2019 Remembrance Day story. This
Right.
unknown war hero of Douglas Clark, whose biography I'd written. And suddenly that imposter syndrome that I've just been talking about had really been chipped away at. And I just thought, can I do it? Can I be the one to do it? I didn't feel like anybody cared, as you know, could possibly care more than me about the story of the Bulldogs. As I say, it had gone on 2 decades now. I had my fandom and my obsession's probably a bit strong at that point. It turned into an obsession, but you know, inclination with the story and following the story all that time. And yeah, I just decided I sort of got a burst of confidence. I thought I can do it, and I think I'm the right person to do it. And it couldn't possibly have gone much better, really.
So for anyone who is kind of listening today who isn't particularly familiar with the British Bulldogs or indeed professional wrestling at large, can you kind of briefly talk us through just how influential and popular they were, especially in the mid-1980s? Because there was a time when they were pretty much everywhere, right?
Yeah, everywhere, literally all over the world, you know, and it was a real golden era for wrestling, a golden global era for wrestling that they probably never even dreamt they would see. You know, they got into wrestling as a alternative to going down the mines, you know, and or being builders or bricklayers, whatever it might have been. That was the limited career options that a young boy from a small mining town in the north of England might have. Wigan as such synonymous history with professional wrestling, going back to the dawn of the sport, really. And so they had that natural. They had the amenities around them where they could train. They got Tom in particular was such a natural at it that he was on TV by the time he was 16, 17 years old. But they thought that was it. They were still only earning a normal young working man's wage doing that with joint promotions. They weren't to know that around the corner they would get cherry-picked to go to Stampede Wrestling in Canada, and then round another corner, Vince McMahon would launch pro wrestling into a global phenomenon that it turned out to be, and that they would be in the right place at the right time with as much talent in the world as anybody could possibly have in the sport. Because of that background, they'd started in the right way. That they took zero shortcuts in the training. Then they knew their talent inside out. But the beauty of the time was pre-internet. They could go to Japan as a tag team and be absolutely revolutionary as a tag team because of their almost telepathic communication, being first cousins, having the same background, the same training, the double teams that they were doing, the eye impact, the agility. It had never really been seen before. The launch tag team wrestling into a new stratosphere. That first happened in Japan, and at the same time, they were still wrestling in Canada as sworn mortal enemies. And
sure.
having these amazing matches against each other. And this was at a time when, before now, where wrestlers will quite happily go on social media and talk to each other as friends to a global audience and then go and pretend to be enemies. It wasn't like that at the time. Kayfabe was absolute, and they had to adhere to it all the time, and it could be done in a pre-internet age. And so by the time they got snapped up in 1985 by Vince McMahon finally to go to the WWF and earn the truly big bucks, they'd honed both wrestling against and together. They'd almost perfected what was known as a junior heavyweight style at the time, and particularly translating that into tag team wrestling between them and their brothers-in-law, the Art Foundation. They turned tag team wrestling from slow, plodding, and sort of methodical paint by numbers style wrestling matches to unpredictable, high impact, high octane masterpieces that they still are now, and they were the ones that did that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's fascinating about them is there's this body of work which still, we're talking 3 decades later, and it's continuing to just have so much influence. 4 decades later, actually, when I think about it, we're talking early 80s, aren't we? Really early to mid 80s, continuing to have so much impact and influence on the style that's popular today. One of the reasons that I personally thought the book was so compelling is the meticulous amount of research that's clearly gone into it. I mean, in this book, you're covering so much ground from Billington and Smith's upbringings and their rise through the British ranks to their days in Stampede in Calgary, to their tenures in the WWF in Japan, and then, of course, the challenges that they faced personally along the way. Talk me through how you approached your research for the book. So how long did it take in total? Where did you turn for information? And how much of the narrative is fact versus fiction?
Oh, well, that's fresh in my mind. I'll just tackle that bit first, Ben. Nothing in it is fiction. If anything in it didn't happen or isn't true, it's not my pen that's made it that way. Everything is based on first-hand testimony, be it in one of the many protagonist books that have been written, or the unbelievable amount of shoot interviews that's around at the time. Spent days and weeks and months of my life watching wrestling shoot interviews to try and just, hopefully one of them will just mention the Bulldog, a little anecdote, a little statement, a little quote, here, there, everywhere. Obviously, I did a lot of first-hand interviews myself with family members. So many wrestling podcasts about at the minute. You could go on forever. If you could research something like this, at some point you've got to know where to draw the line almost. There's so much material out there now. And I would say that to anybody who's who might have an ambition, no matter how far away it might seem, to write a book or be an author, especially on something true life. We've never been in a better place to do it. You can do research while you're on a train on your phone. You've got a library in your hand, where in the olden days you might have to go um, to various libraries all over a country, all over the world, and scroll through dusty manuscripts and things. We don't have to do that anymore. We've never been in a better place to do research, and yes, so many wrestling books, wrestling podcasts, and my own personal interviews with so many of the people around and involved at the time. I just managed to put it all into a logical order that made sense to me, or things that I didn't include, just because I was trying to tell a story. It's not a biography about one or both men. I wanted to tell the story of them growing up in this mining town, which as I say, is close to my heart. I share that heritage. To them, both of them having a tragic end, but having the roller coaster ride as individuals, the relationships with each other, the relationships with other people, the triumphs and the tragedies along the way. And yeah, I managed to just do enough research, be it clawing from all corners of the internet or managing to speak to some amazing people to pull it all together.
I mean, one of the things that I think is so kind of encompassing about this book is it's not just an exploration of the Bulldogs, but it's also really a story of the evolution and change that professional wrestling went through over the period from, say, the late 70s until the mid 90s. You've got a foreword in there from Ross Hart. So as well as being brother-in-law to the pair, also I know that Ross is a wrestling historian kind of in his own right. How crucial was Ross to helping you bring this narrative together?
Crucial in terms of it being the book that it ended up being. I was already well on the way. I'd signed on the dotted line with Pitch Publishing. I was going to do Dynamite and Davey before I'd spoken to Ross, but it would not be it wouldn't be nearly 400 pages, and it wouldn't be as compelling, I don't think, as it is, and have the quite unique insight that it has if it wasn't been for Ross. It was Bruce Hart that I was so desperate to speak to. So there's 12 Hart siblings. There was 12 Hart siblings. Brett being the sort of most famous, along with his brother Owen. Bruce was instrumental in. Bruce is the older brother to both Brett and Owen, and he was instrumental in this story. He was over here on a bit of a wrestling tour and discovered Dynamite. And then he went on to have a real roller coaster relationship with both Tom and Davey. A real crucial part of the story. He'd written his own book as well, which was a crucial resource material. But I really wanted to speak to him. I wanted him to clarify a few things for me and get his own unique perspective on a couple of things. And I managed to finally get through to Bruce. I'd sent sort of cold called, cold messaged, cold emailed various members of the extended family. Obviously, for them that are listening who don't know, Dynamite and Davey are cousins to start with. They both married directly or indirectly into the Hart family, which were 12 siblings already. So you've got this sort of extended dynasty of fantastic wrestlers from around the world. And I'd sent messages to various people, but I'm guessing they've heard it all before. There's been quite a few documentaries and things about the Hart family, more than Dynamite and Davey already. I'm guessing they get this thing quite a lot. So I was struggling to hear anything back. But it was Bruce, first of all, that I was desperate to speak to, and a wrestling historian that I knew did have an open line to Bruce. And so he put me in touch with him. And Bruce was kind enough to give me sort of 3 or 4 hour interview. We spoke. It was really great, really brilliant to speak to. And I must have made a positive impression. I didn't ask him to put me in touch with anybody else. I was really happy with his insight to start with. But out of nowhere, Bronwyn Billington and Ross Hart Ross first. Ross got in touch with me and said, "Look, Steve, I've heard about this book you're going to write. My brother Bruce has told me that he thinks it's going to be really good, vouched for you as a person, as a researcher, said you're asking all the right questions. Is there anything I can help you with?" I thought, wow, brilliant. 2 Hart brothers involved. So I had the same sort of 3 or 4 hour Skype with Ross, but we really hit it off, who is such a personable guy, and we exchanged emails, and I just got confident enough where I felt like I could just drop him an email at any time of day, and he would always get back to me. He would always get back to me, not only with an answer to the question that I'd asked, but lots more, in the general scheme of how the landscape was at the time. As I'm guessing he was almost just thinking, this might be useful to him, this might be useful to him. So I'd get these long emails, which was just priceless research for me from Ross. And that carried on for the next 12 or 18 months, still carries on now. We still speak now. So that were really brilliant. And then Bronwyn Billington, Tom's daughter, who lives in Canada, got in touch with me because Ross had told her that I'd made such a positive impression. So she was on board at that point too. And me and Bronwyn became really close friends, actually. And we speak, at least every week. We'll exchange messages, and she was brilliant enough and humble enough to. I did tell the story of how she became reunited with her dad and how she felt towards her dad in them final few years. And no matter how talented of a writer I might be, that's for everybody else to make their own mind up. I didn't feel like that was the only bit that I thought, I can't tell that story as good as she can. So I asked her if she would write that as the afterword. It's sort of the final poignant jigsaw piece of the book. And it's actually the bit that I get most feedback about. So the only bit of the book,
I mean, it's
only 3 pages of the book that I didn't write myself.
No, but it's a beautiful afterword, and it's so touching, and that's something I wanted to talk about in terms of Bronwyn's involvement in the book. So obviously, I know there was a long period during which Bronwyn and her father were estranged from one another. Do you think that working with you to tell her father's story was a cathartic experience for her to go through?
Well, I know it was. She's told me lots of times. She's thanked me multiple times for giving her the opportunity, and I've explained to her, no, it's completely the way around. I owe her all the thanks for all the help that she gave and continues to give. I think she's spoken about that experience with her dad on quite a few podcasts and things. It's something that people want to speak to her about. But I think having the opportunity to sit down in a quiet room and really, she doesn't only write an afterword, she writes like a letter to her dad as well. To be able to sort of cleanse her mind of all that and get it down on paper where it'll stand the test of time. She's thanked me for that opportunity, and I know how much it means to have that out there now for everybody to read forevermore.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that kind of really struck me when reading the book is the kind of evolution of the character of the Dynamite Kid. It was really interesting, kind of how my attitude and thoughts developed as I went on, and I really came out of the book with quite a lot of sympathy for him as I turned more of the pages. I mean, it's clear that he had many personal troubles and insecurities, but he was also clearly an incredibly proud man and unquestionably one of the greatest, most innovative wrestlers of all time. I mean, his influence is still very much being felt today. How did your views towards him change as you wrote the book?
It really did. It did quite a lot, and it weren't something that I were fully expecting. I knew, like everybody else, I think as humans, it's probably a flaw within us all that some people probably more so than others. Me and you are probably on the not very bad side of it. I think the book would speak to that for myself. But I think a lot of people have got a natural tendency to focus on the bad stuff and the negative, and that's probably what gets more headlines and stands the test of time. And when I first started on this journey, it felt like the first thing that sprung to everybody's mind when you mentioned the Dynamite Kid was negative things. It almost felt like that. If you can imagine a seesaw, it felt like the negative aspects that people remember of him had begun to outweigh the positives, especially with regards to his wrestling. And it, I didn't think about that much at the time. I just wanted to tell the story as my research dictated. I didn't want it to come across as any kind of whitewashing for either of the guys, but I also didn't want it to come across as certainly didn't want it to come across as a hit job. I wanted to enhance both guys' legacies. So I didn't really know where that journey was going to take me, especially with regards to Tom. But I did find myself as I researched things like CTE and I researched things, obviously speaking to his family. And I think because they're quite private people, really, a lot of people will remember the things that Michelle might have spoken out about 15 years ago, his ex-wife, but with her own journey and discovery of CTE and obviously time being a great healer, she's completely forgiven Tom. And up until the Dark Side of the Ring documentary coming out, nobody really knew that. Everybody thought that probably that Michelle was still quite a bit towards Tom, and that's just not true at all. She's forgiven him completely. His family have forgiven him completely. They remember the good times, of which there were many. But all them good times, especially the stuff that happened behind closed doors, it felt like nobody really cared about all that. So I made sure that I put some things in from the family point of view. I asked Bronwyn particularly for her own positive memories of her dad as a father, made sure I got some of that in there. And yeah, by the end of it, I found myself, I really liked Tom, it was so nice to see them pictures where he looks happy at the end with Bronwyn, speaking to Brett over Skype and things like that. It just, I'd like to think that during reading the book, everybody goes on the same journey that I did and that you've said you did, where if you are, I want people who've got that negative, that feeling they might have at the minute towards Tom to read the book. And I don't think they will have after they've finished reading it. Nobody's going to, because if I hadn't have put the negative stuff in there, you'd have put the book down and gone, I don't trust it because it didn't include all that. By including the negative, but adding lots of perspective and context and testimony from people, you really get to sense the positive side of his character.
Yeah, you've definitely done that, and I think that's probably why one of the reasons it's resonated as strongly as it has. I mean, in a world that is saturated with wrestling books these days, and as you said, there's just so much information everywhere. Dynamite Davey has received some very high critical praise from big names within the wrestling industry, from multiple-time world champions Chris Jericho and Mick Foley, who are both highly successful authors in their own right, through to, as you mentioned earlier, legendary wrestler Bret Hitman Hart, the brother-in-law to both men. Now, Bret described your book as a fine account that will satisfy all British Bulldog fans. And I understand that you recently met with Bret to discuss the book. What was the experience like for you?
Yeah, it was very surreal. He's a wonderful guy. I think a lot of people know that. He sort of disappeared off everybody's radar for a long time, did Bret. I think he's not somebody that seeks the limelight in any way, shape, or form. And because his book is so brilliant and all-encompassing and thorough, I didn't feel the need to. I remember speaking to my brother, like, "Oh, you must try and interview Bret," and all like. I didn't want it to come across like I was just desperate to speak to one of my childhood heroes for the sake of speaking to him. I thought, well, what would I ask him that isn't already in his book? And I knew from some quotes that he's made over the years that he stands by what's in his book. And I thought, well, it's so thorough anyway. So I thought I don't want to come across like that. I'll stick to what I think is a bit more achievable, a bit more ingrained within the story, with like Bruce and Ross, and rather than just sort of come across as a fanboy to Bret. But then all of a sudden it came across as I was speaking to Ross at length. Obviously, he learned through talking to me that we're a big Bret fan, and I think I mentioned to him that just his endorsement would go a long way if he could read a final draft. And then I was sat one day just looking through my emails, clearing all my emails out, happened to go into my spam, and there was an email with the subject line, Hitman reaching out. And it nearly just went straight in. I thought, what's that? Hitman reaching out. And I clicked on it, and it'd taken the time to send me an email to tell me that he'd read the final draft, he really liked it, and congratulate me. And I thought that was so in keeping with the man that I had led to believe he was. I thought that was really great. And he gave me his phone number and told me to give him a ring sometime, which I did. And we had a 30-minute discussion over the phone, which were really nice. We talked about British wrestling and things. And then he was over here for the Clash at the Castle, the sort of unofficial anniversary show for the SummerSlam 92. And we exchanged some text messages, and he invited me along to his hotel for a drink and a chat. And we did that. I spent an hour or so in his company. It was so fantastic. In fact, a little story I've got here. This is the book. This was, I suppose you could say, my paperback version of Brett's book, which I've had a lot of years. And as you can see, it's all highlighted and read multiple times. And I thought, well, I was tempted to, for the meeting with him, I was tempted to get a new glossy hardback version. I thought, no, that'd be a bit unauthentic. I want him to sign this one. It means a lot to me. And obviously, because the covers have dropped off, I thought, where shall I get him to sign? He couldn't sign on the more traditional places where he might sign. I thought, well, I want him to sign the final page where he ends the book, almost like he's signing it off. But as we're talking, I got the book out. I thought, I hope he's not insulted by the fact that it looks like a pretty besmirched version of what was his book. I thought, so I were almost handing it to him apologetically, and he just said the word straight up the tongue. He just went, Steve, there is no bigger compliment than a well-read book. And I thought, yeah, that's
absolutely.
Right. I'd love it if somebody showed me a picture of my books one in years to come, and all covers had fallen off because it had been read that much. And sure enough, that is exactly, when I got it home and dared to open the page that he'd signed, that is exactly what it says. To Steve, no bigger compliment than a well-read book. Brett the Hitman Hart. And yeah, it was hugely humble. Within 2 minutes of sitting down with him, as I say, one of my childhood heroes, any nerves had gone because he's just so just instantly puts you at ease in his company. He's a really humble man who's got no airs or graces and doesn't make you feel in any way sort of beneath him, like some people of that stature might do. So yeah, we're a great journey. But yeah, and then I've since done Chris Jericho's podcast, Talk is Jericho. That was another surreal experience, a bit of a hero of mine that I got to speak to. And as you say, Brett, Mick Foley and Chris Jericho, quite sort of unofficially, but I think everybody believes that theirs are the best 3 wrestling books ever written. It's sort of, I'm not sure whether it's a coincidence or not, that they're the 3 sort of main superstars that have come out with so much praise of Dynamite and Davey. It could be a coincidence, or it could be that
it's interesting because I said to you when we were texting and I read your book, I said, I'm putting this right up there with Jericho's first, Fody's first, and Brett's as my 4th in my top 4 wrestling books. And you said immediately they're the 3 that have come back to me. And I think it's because, again, of that meticulous level of detail. There's 2 elements here. There's one is being very, very real about, professional wrestling is a very, very high gloss, polished production, certainly for wrestling that we've grown up on for the last 30 years. But what all of those books have in common, and what your book has in common, is they are very real portrayals of the human beings that lie behind that presentation. I think that's why many people refer to Brett's book and resonate to that so strongly, is because he pulls no punches in terms of, the realities of being a global wrestling superstar and all the pressures that entailed. So it doesn't surprise me that you've had similarities to them, but it must be incredibly humbling as an author who entered into this as a fan with a passion project to receive praise. The other thing that interests me from what you said is, I think you and I, as you said, both grew up in our young days as fans of this larger than life sport or form of entertainment. As the years have gone by, both of us have become far more interested in the stories that lie behind the scenes and the mechanisms behind this production and what it entails as a media product. And I understand what you're saying, because in terms of, myself as a journalist and a podcast host, yourself and a writer, I'm very passionate about using this podcast as a platform to allow some of those incredibly talented individuals to tell their stories and about the journeys they went on throughout those years. And I know you are through your writing, but it's quite challenging to convince those individuals that perhaps you're not entering as a fan, but you are entering as a curious professional who has admiration for them, but ultimately wants to help them to tell their story to new people.
Absolutely. I think that's what it is. And it's about how you tell the story and how you achieve that in a way that's not just regurgitating things that's been out there before and putting it in a concise way. I'm obsessed since writing my first book. I've loved books for so long, but I know what I like. I know what I like to read, and I've always said with my own writing, I want to write books that I would want to read, depicted in a style that I would want to read. And so that's why, going back to when you asked about the sort of fact or fiction, and I stress that none of it is fiction. I think where people assume that some of it might be is because I've told the story largely in scenes. It's the old addict of storytelling: show the reader, don't just tell them. If you can show them somebody's personality trait or something that happened by describing a scene or with the dialogue, then do it that way. It's much more interesting to the reader and creates a much more rounded version of the personality and the events. And so obviously that involves me, and I've put a little disclaimer at the start that some of the dialogue and some of the minor detail is whatever word I've used. It's not fiction, but whatever it might be. So I think people have assumed that some of these sections of dialogue or some of these whole scenes that I've created are out of my mind, and that is absolutely not true. Every single one of them is one that I have learnt about. And yes, so I might know of one or two statements or sentences that got said in this scene or in this conversation, and so I've dressed the rest up to make it a scene that the reader can absorb and get together as a concise whole. So a prime example is when Dynamite's broken his back. They're still the tag team champions. Brett goes to see him at the hospital. Vince McMahon's sort of tasks Brett a little bit with, can you convince him to give up the belts? Brett describes what happened in that hospital at the side of his bed in his book. Dynamite describes it in his book. They're quite slightly different, the terms, and Brett says what he says. And I've brought them two together to create a scene that I think's fair on both points of view, tells the reader what happened, and also respects both guys' point of view and what they've written in the past. So I did that, 100 times maybe throughout the book, where I brought these sources together. And so it might come across, and all the sources are completely listed in the back, chapter by chapter, if people are interested to go and find out who or where I got that, which sources I pulled together to create those scenes. It's all there in the back. And so I just thought that was a much more interesting way to do it, and it seems to be something that's gone down really well, rather than just have, a straight quote from Dynamite's book and then but Brett wrote this in his book, and then next thing, it gets a bit cumbersome and a bit clunky. I didn't want that. I wanted it to flow naturally, sort of all through my voice as the narrator. And it seems to have gone down really well, and it's something I'm excited to continue with.
So obviously Dynamite and Davey isn't your first book. It's actually your third. And it'd be great to hear a bit more about your two previous releases. So From Triumph to Tragedy and The Man of All Talents. Can you tell us a bit more about these? And also, is there a kind of central thread that unites all of your books? And what compels you to take such a deep dive into a particular individual or subject matter?
Well, we'll wind clock quite far back, if that's all right then, Ben.
Sure.
As I said earlier, I'd got this I developed this itch that I felt I needed to scratch probably 10 years ago now. I felt like it was something I could do. Um, and then I'd developed some anxiety issues, and I'd started writing for that, really, for my own good. I almost like sort of writing letters to myself, or a bit of memoir type stuff, going over where I think things had developed in the anxiety front, or just some memories. It was something that a therapist had told me to do, and I found it
Mm.
so good. And my wife now, she wasn't my wife at the time, were reading them, and I'd suddenly walk in the kitchen, and she might be laughing or she might be crying, and she said, "You're really good at this." And I said, "Oh." So I hadn't told her at that point that I'd got this itch to scratch to one day maybe write a book. And so time went on. I also had a friend that hit on some hard times, actually, and he was involved in a bad motor accident, and actually spent a short amount of time in prison because of that. That's another issue that it's not my space to go into. But I felt so sorry for him. It was a genuine accident, and he told me. I went to visit him, and he told me that he was getting letters from family members. He was limited to how many letters he could send and receive, but they weren't limited to how long they could be. So I thought, well, I'll send him some really long ones every time it's my turn. He wants me to send him one. I'll send him a really long one. So I'd write about some times that we'd shared together or some memories. And when he got out and we met up, he explained to me how much that had meant to him and how much they were. And he said, I read them multiple times. He said he'd still kept them now. And he again said, "You're really good at it." And I thought, just sort of reinforced this thing that I thought I could maybe do it. I went to Brazil for the Football World Cup in 2014. I spent 6 weeks there. England were only there for 2 weeks, but that's another story. I was there for 6.
Different team.
Two friends. And I came back with a real affinity for the country, and one friend in particular that I stayed in touch with is still in touch now. And I fell in love with their football, not just the sort of national team that we see. I did a bit of research into I fell in love with the city of Rio. I found out that they'd got these 4 clubs that had these war-like rivalries, bitter enemies, and did a bit of research into that and the structure of the domestic football scene. And then at the end of 2016, November 2016, in fact, as we record this, it's just about the 6th anniversary. One of their teams was on their way to the biggest match of their history. It was the equivalent of the European Europa League final, and these had been amateur players just a few years earlier. They'd gone rocketing through the ranks. It was a real underdog story. They'd got to the pinnacle of Brazilian football, all the way to a continental final, and the plane crashed on the way, and almost all of the team died. Lots and lots of media died.
Wow.
71 out of 76 on the plane died. I felt, like it meant a lot to me because I'd got this affinity. So I was asking my friend over there, and he was sending me news articles that he were translating for me, or I was putting them through Google Translate. He was sending me news articles through YouTube that he was putting English subtitles on for me from Portuguese. And over the course of time, I found myself more and more hooked on the story. 2 aspects of the story: the scandalous of how the crash had happened. There's people in prison now for how that crash happened, and also the sporting story of this rise from nothing. They were playing on dusty fields just 9 years earlier in their equivalent of non-league, and they've made this meteoric romantic rise to the top. And then this had happened. A lot of them were the same players. It weren't like over here where you might just get, every time they got a promotion, that team would get ushered out of the door and some glossy note.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, it was the same players that had rose to the top. I thought it was such an amazing twofold story. And one day I just thought to myself, if I don't do it about this, I'll never do it. Just forget about it. You'll never do it. It's this or nothing. So I decided to have a go. I had no idea where I was going to take it in terms of publishing or getting it out there. I just thought, this sort of anxiety that I'd got keeping up with my writing, to sort of vent that. Overthinking is sort of a big problem of mine. If I could obsess over something healthy rather than something unhealthy, something positive rather than something negative, great. So I poured all my overthinking mind into this project that I'd got no idea where I was going to end up with it. I had a break from the writing as it was going to be, as it were the lead up to my wedding. I was about halfway through. I'd written about 30,000 words. I'd about what I planned to do. Well, it was about halfway through, but I'd down tools a little bit on it for 2 or 3 months. I decided whilst on honeymoon to fire it back up while the wife were having her lay-in.
How did that
Fire
go
this
down?
back up, get the iPad out, fire it back up, see where I land with it. And I thought, before I carry on, I'm going to see if I can get it anyway. So I did a bit of research into self-publishing, or traditional publishing, or an hybrid of the two that you can do. And I fired it off what I'd done so far with a cover letter and things to a few publishers that I thought might be interested. I got some interest back, but nothing I was really happy with. And self-publishing scared me a little bit. I think that would have been the ultimate example of imposter syndrome. I just could. I felt like my first one in particular needed to be quality assured, if you like. I didn't want to just put any old rubbish out there. And then out of nowhere, well down the line, another months down the line, I'd sort of carried on with it, but tentatively not sure where it was going to end up. I got an email from Paul from Pitch Publishing. A couple of lines. Yeah, love it. Let's do it. Oh, wow. And so I met up with Paul. We agreed to do it. It went really well. The final product has been so well received. And so, yeah, that's you'd think that might have scratched that itch, but it didn't. The itch got a little bit stronger. And I was stood around one day. I remember stood around thinking about what I was going to do next. I'd put the kettle on in the kitchen, and I'd got a couple of mild ideas, but nothing that really sprung out to me to launch myself into with that level of passion that I think comes off the pages when you're really, really passionate about a subject. When all of a sudden, as I say, we've already been through the wrestling fandom. I noticed on Twitter, or scrolling through, it was a couple of pictures from a display at the Imperial War Museum North, the one in Manchester. And there was a man, big, huge, life-size pictures of a man in wrestling attire, really oldie worldy style wrestling attire, and him also wearing Great Britain rugby union kits from sort of early 1900s. And then there was the blurbs that the Imperial War Museum had put on about him being a world champion wrestler, one of the greatest rugby league players of all time. So rugby league. Oh wow, what a story! What a story that is. Did a little bit of separate research, found out that it was from just around the corner from where I was stood. It was from Huddersfield, where I live now with my wife, and it was very local to our little village. So I did a lot more research on him, found out he got this most amazing, unique story. He was one of the pioneers, one of the true pioneers of rugby league, and is still regarded as one of the greatest ever players. He was a world champion in a legitimate form of wrestling, his local wrestling, at the same time that he was launching his rugby league career. World War I, he went to World War I, kept some diaries, which not many did, there in the Imperial War Museum in London. And he was effectively, if you've seen the film Hacksaw Ridge, he was effectively the UK's version of Hacksaw Ridge, in the British version of Hacksaw Ridge in World War I. Because he'd got this huge, mammoth, strong man, as you might expect, rugby league player and world champion wrestler. And he was carrying his comrades, his fallen comrades, out two at a time on his shoulders, and saved countless lives. Got peppered with shrapnel repeatedly, got discharged with full military medals, British bravery medals, and went back and had a second rugby league Hall of Fame career, got back in the British Lions team. And then when he did finally hang his boots up, he decided to turn to pro wrestling, which had just sort of come to these shores. And he ended up being British and world heavyweight champion in pro wrestling. It's the most amazing story. I've just sort of scratched the surface of it there. So I did that, and as I say, in fact, you'll love this story. You'll love this story, Ben, and I'd like to think your listeners will as well. I went to his last surviving sort of direct relative. Is obviously family tree spawn out everywhere. He's got relatives overseas that are different levels of removed. But his last surviving sort of blood relative, his niece. She'll be in her late 80s now, Elizabeth. What a lovely, lovely lady. She invited me down. She lives at Gloucester now. I managed to make contact with her, and because she's his last surviving relative, she's like the curator of his estate, really, and all this. So she keeps, thousands of newspaper cuttings and all his memorabilia, a lot of his medals and things. But she donated, so there was so much that she donated, lots and lots, to the Imperial War Museum. So I went to the Imperial War Museum and went through all his war diaries and a lot of the medals and pictures that are there, and then went to her house. She invited me to her house and she put a little spread on for me. And I got chatting to her as we did. Well, it was a lovely afternoon. And I happened to mention something. I'm not even sure what the words were, but I happened to mention something about pro wrestling being worked, or whatever term it were I used. For a moment of silence, and then she went, "Oh no!" And then the next conversation, I weren't sure how that had landed. I remember thinking, oh. And then she brought the subject back onto the pro wrestling side of his career and said, "Of course, Uncle Douglas would never have taken part in anything like that." Well,
Yeah.
like what? And she called it match fixing. And I tried explaining to her that there was a difference between, the art of pro wrestling and match fixing. I mean, at the time, it was sort of blurred lines. That is how it developed. So I felt a bit guilty. I tried explaining to it, but I felt like somebody explaining to it, explaining that Santa wasn't real or something like that. And I felt like I'd upset this lady who was so hospitable to me. So I went home, and it were on my mind all the time. When I got home, I looked at my email. She'd actually sent me an email saying that, I want to stress to you, because obviously he'd won so much in his legitimate form of wrestling. I thought, how do I get around this? But the truth is, because kayfabe was so absolute at the time, he'd never broken kayfabe. So I thought, well, it'd be kind of disrespectful for me to break it on his behalf. It appeared that he'd never broken kayfabe even to his family. So I were there going to write a book. I thought, no, I'm not comfortable with that. Who knows? She might even be right. All my research suggested that that is when pro wrestling had come in, and that is. So I decided to write the book. So all I'd got tomes and tomes of his war diaries, so I knew that intimately. He'd wrote some memoirs about his rugby league life and his early in Cumberland and Westmoreland wrestling. He'd written a lot about that. So I'd got all these sources. I didn't have much on his pro wrestling because he'd never spoken that much about it. I can only assume that was part of his maintaining kayfabe. All I'd got were all his lists and lists of the events that he'd been at, matches that he'd had, championships that he'd won, match reports of the bigger matches, the stadium type matches that he'd had, the world championship type matches. I'd got the newspaper clippings and reports of them. Of course, even the newspaper reports are written. The reporters would have fully believed that this was a legitimate
different time
as well. So everything I had was actually from the legitimate point. So I decided to write part 3 of the book. It's sort of split into 3 parts for each of the distinct parts of his life. I decided to write part 3 of the book in kayfabe, to sort of out of respect for him, out of respect for Elizabeth. And it was so enjoyable almost being able to put myself in his shoes for his pro wrestling life, and that bit, as opposed to the Dynamite and Davey, I did actually fictionalize some of that, because I felt like I'd got that ability to do that. He'd avoided, I thought I'll speak about it on his behalf, but always from a legitimate point of view, and it was and it was wonderfully well received. And I've even had people come up and ask me, so when because and I love the fact that they have to ask me that question. It feels like I got it right that bit. But then, as I said earlier, that got picked up by a Daily Mirror journalist who put it on the front page of the Mirror Group. I think they've got 3 papers that the Mirror Group run, and they've put it on the front page as their lead Remembrance Day story in 2019, and that that gave me the confidence, I think, to the reception that got after it got that level of exposure, give me the confidence to really kick on. As I say, when the publisher then asked me what I wanted to do next, I'd got this yet another itch that needed scratching, that was Dynamite and Davey.
Well, you'll never scratch that itch. Having found something you love to do, that itch is only going to go stronger.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right.
One thing that I'm interested in is, so you had that kind of quite sizable and unexpected mainstream exposure in late 2019 around the second book and the story that unearthed. But there's so much content out there these days, and there is so much competition vying for everyone's attention. As still a relatively new author and quite a niche author, is it hard to stand out and be seen within the literary marketplace? Like, what challenges have you faced on this journey so far?
It is difficult. You do feel like you're sort of lost in the stampede a little bit. I think there's so much out there. You've got to try and turn that into a positive. There's a lot of podcasts out there, like the one we're doing now. This wouldn't have existed. It's easier to get publicity now, you could argue, because you've got your own social medias to curate and use, and doing podcasts like this helps. Every little one helps a little bit. Helps us introduce it to a slightly new audience. But in way of competition, you've just got so much more now. Everybody's got a Netflix account. Why would you go out and it used to be that a book was cheaper than a DVD, and you might have 10 hours worth of reading with a book, and you'd only got 2 hours with a film. So a book was far better value for money. Whereas now everybody's got a Netflix account. By the time your monthly subscription's done, you're effectively watching TV for free now. You're watching everything that you watch for free, and everybody's got to dig in the pockets in a cost of living crisis to go out and purchase a book, extra money. So it is difficult to sort of put your head above the parapet. There is so much out there. But what you've got to bear in mind is, if somebody had told me that, I don't know the exact numbers. It's not something that that I dwell on. I think that could be too much of a distraction if I did, either from a positive or negative point of view, depending which way it went. But I would say, I'm sort of estimating, but I probably think about 10,000 people now have read my books. If somebody had told me that 5 years ago, there's not much in the form of money that can replace that feeling of accomplishment. And I just think you've got to let everybody else. I'm only here because the world has enabled us all to have the ability to do these certain things and to chase your dreams. It'd be wrong for me to not wish somebody else would, just so that I could get that extra little bit of space on the market. I would sooner everybody try and follow the dreams, everybody try and put some content out there. And, at that point, it's a healthy marketplace. Part of the content that's out there so much is podcasts, but podcasts have played such an important role in both my publicity, but even more importantly, my research. So you've just got to see it all as a positive, really, and try and just be part of that rat run.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the right attitude to have. So what's next then? Dynamite and Davey's out now. What comes next? Have you got the itch to scratch again?
Well, because this has each book, both in terms of its reach and its every book's sort of moved on and all step. Even physically, you can see first one, second one, third one. They're getting bigger, but they're getting bigger in the marketplace, in their appeal. And I kind of want to keep that moving forward, which is going to be difficult to do because Dynamite and Davey's gone down so well and had such a mainstream appeal. It's the first one. Pitch Publishing have just sort of put the toe in the water with audiobooks, and they've picked mine out as one of the first ones. That's available now. I've recorded that myself, which is another string to the bow. And so everyone's sort of getting that little bit more wide-ranging in its appeal, and I'd like to keep that going. It's going to be difficult. I've got 2 or 3 ideas, and I'm just sort of letting them percolate. I'm doing a little bit of steady research on each one and seeing which one truly grasps me and puts its head above the parapet. So yeah, one of them which I have mentioned on social media that I'm considering is Gentleman Chris Adams, a biography about him which has never been done. Very similar to Dynamite and Davey, very similar story in terms of his what he was being a British professional wrestler that went over the Atlantic and sought his riches in the United States, and also part of that era that made such a tragic sort of mark on the industry, really. But his story is also a roller coaster and one that's never been done. So I'm doing a bit of tentative research on that to see if I think that's viable. And there's also, I won't give too much away because I haven't spoken to anybody, including family members or anything yet. But there's a real true crime story out there that's got a strong football link to it that I'm doing a bit of research on at the minute that I think would really go down well and people would like. So yeah, I'll definitely be doing one. There's no doubt about that. But it's a matter of picking the right subject that really gets the juices flowing again.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of questions just to ask Stephen before we wrap up on going back to Dynamite and Davey. For anyone who hasn't really seen their body of work and isn't really familiar, with the British Bulldog style, is there one match or kind of series of matches that you would point to from your extensive research to say, yes, that is the definitive showcase of who they are and what they did?
If we're talking about one match, I would definitely say pick any of the series of matches that they had in the sort of 86, 87 WWF run against the Art Foundation. That sort of wraps up everything in a tidy little bow because their matches are sensational. They are the ones that launched global tag team wrestling into the stratosphere and quickly showcases their talent when they were both sort of at the best. There was a brief window between Dynamite being at his true best in the early 80s and Davey being at his true best in the probably late 80s, early 90s. There was a short window of opportunity in the 85, 86, 87 era where they were both probably around about the best. And those matches with the Art Foundation, who were both their brothers-in-law, they knew all 4 of them knew their styles intimately, and what they created was absolutely magic. And that is the true legacy that we still see today from them, I think. Individually, you can go and see Dynamite's matches with Tiger Mask, Davey Boy's matches against Brett on a more mainstream appeal later on in the 90s. But yeah, if you just want to see the British Bulldogs in true British Bulldogs action, I'd say it's the Art Foundation in the mid-80s.
And we saw Davey Boy Smith belatedly get inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame during the pandemic in 2020. Do you think we'll ever see the British Bulldogs go in as a tandem?
Yes, I say that very tentatively because I'm not sure. I think the fact that the Art Foundation without getting too deep on it all, obviously that has a bit of a wider stretching. They went in as a tag team, but the Art Foundation became more synonymous because it reappeared in the late 90s. So I don't think with the Art Foundation be there. I think the British Bulldogs should be there. I think the two go hand in hand. David Boy was a decade or so late going in. I would personally argue that the Dynamite Kid should be in there as a solo anyway, because I think it was all right for a lot of years when it was the WWF or WWE Hall of Fame, and it was the ones who'd made the biggest impact for that organisation. I think you could argue, even though it was sensational in that brief run, it was only a brief run. So I think they could kind of justify him not being in there, but now they've opened it up to it's more of the highest echelon of wrestling Hall of Fame, and you've got many stars in there who had little or no impact on the WWE product directly. Some of them were never even wrestled for WWE. So I think at that point you're struggling to justify Dynamite not being in there from a pure wrestling point of view. I think now, especially I'd like to think my book's been a big part of that seesaw that I wrote about earlier. I think it's now edged towards it's when people hear the Dynamite Kid now, they think of more positive things in terms of his wrestling legacy, and the extra family testimony that's now out there of forgiveness. And I think that it wraps his story up so nicely, you know, with the positive ending from Bronwyn. I personally think that seesaw is now firmly in the balance of the positive, which I think, bearing in mind, is influence and legacy within the wrestling world, I think should more than qualify him over countless people that are in there. I'm not sure if Dynamite being a little bit of a one that got away for Vince McMahon was an influence on Vince, and maybe not putting him in over the years. You know, he did want them back as a tag team, and Dynamite told him in no uncertain terms, no. There's not many people said no to Vince McMahon to go back wrestling or wrestling to start with. I do feel like Vince maybe held a little bit of a grudge, and that's why he never went in. But now we're in a post-Vince McMahon era. Who knows, that might help the chances of Dynamite going in either as a solo or as a tag team with Davey Boy. Either way, I think he should be in there. And yeah, I think it'll happen eventually. It's just a matter of when.
It's going to take me a long time to get my head around saying post Vince McMahon era in WWE. Strange times. Well, look, Stephen, all I'd love to say is, you know, thank you for writing this book, really. I mean, I think it's fantastic. I've read many wrestling books in my life. I've been a sponge for wrestling trivia and information, much like you. And, you know, I messaged you after reading it to say what an impact it had on me. And it's filled that gap on my shelf that needed to be filled with the context. So thank you for, you know, thank you as a wrestling fan and someone who loves this business that's been so good to me. Thank you for filling that gap and telling this story.
No, thank you for doing that, what you did by getting in touch with me, because that means an awful lot. As I say, I'm an avid reader, and I think about maybe 2 or 3 times in my life I've looked via social media or an email, maybe 2 or 3 times to get in touch with an author to tell him that his book meant an awful lot to me. It's happened, I'd be guessing, 15 to 20 times. I've received messages, very personal ones, about what the book means to people, and there's no bigger compliment. You know, some people might just put a picture on social media and a couple of words, and that's great, but the private messages where they tell you exactly what it means to them and why, and especially more often than not, they compare it to either Mick or Brett's book or both. There is no bigger compliment to me, because that they were my influences for doing this, and I do feel like a itch has been scratched. It's just another one's developing now. But I'm very grateful for all that feedback.
And it must be really gratifying, because it must be such a lonely journey pulling together a story like this. It must be really nice to see it out in the world, and then to see via social media people actually coming up to you and saying, yeah, I really enjoyed this bit. I really enjoyed this bit.
And you're never sure if you're getting it right. That is the thing. That is the lonely part of the journey. For so long, there's only you really seeing it. And I do try and get feedback as I go from either my wife or, in this, my brother is a valuable sounding board for me. And in this case, I did have Ross as well, who as his relationship developed, felt comfortable enough to send him some early drafts and things. So, but even then, you're never sure how it's going to be.
Ross, I believe, he's an English teacher as well as.
He's an English teacher. I didn't even know that. So when the early draft came back, not only with critically reviewed in terms of its content and that side of things, it also came back with I's dotted and T's crossed and full stops added.
Perfect. Resident as well as historian.
He wears multiple hats, does Ross, in this journey. He's been a godsend, really. So it is when you finally, and the very first review was overall positive. That was one of the ones that brought into question the fact versus fiction thing, and I was stressing. I thought, did I not get that? Did I not put that across right about where I was coming from, and that it was all completely first-hand testimony that I'd manipulated into a coherent whole and a story, but there's certainly none of it I'd use the word fiction for. It almost the first review didn't quite satisfy me that I'd got it right. This long, stressful journey that I've been. I thought, no, and then the positive reviews started coming in, and then the direct messages and the private messages, and then the most satisfying of the lot. I was at a friend's 40th, a barbecue in the summer, late summer, and one of the guests there put his phone in front of me, and it was a picture of Mick Foley's big friendly face with my book next to it. And he said, scroll down that. And it took a while to scroll down because it was such a long review, and it was you could tell he'd put an awful lot of time into this review. Mick. He had no need to, he didn't need to do that at all. And that was the moment when I just sat back and thought, yes, I've got it right. And he said that lonely journey felt like it were over, and I could finally just enjoy the rest of the ride, really. And that's what it's been ever since.
Yeah, Mick's a great guy, and that's a real testament to his character. So how can people get a copy of a book? Where can people find out about what you're up to, and what are your socials and your websites? Plug away. Stephen_Bell, Stephen with a V, Stephen_Bell 1985 is both my Twitter and my Instagram. I keep them quite regularly updated with what I'm up to. If anybody's right wing or quite far right wing, you might not like it for very long, because Tories get a bit of a battering on it. But other than that, yeah, I'm quite active on there. And in terms of buying the book, I'm rather ashamed to say it, but your easiest course of action is to line Jeff Bezos's pockets and type Dynamite and Davey in your search bar on Amazon, because that is undoubtedly the easiest way to get anything these days. What about social media for the book itself? I believe the book's on Twitter as well. Yeah, I've got a Twitter account for the book itself, which is at Bulldogs Book 123. I tend to put some exclusive content out there, pictures that maybe didn't quite make the cut for one reason or another, or some extracts on the appropriate anniversaries of when that happened. So yeah, people seem to like seeing that stuff. So yeah, please give it a follow and get in touch if you need to. Well, brilliant. I recommend it as a must read for anyone who's got an interest in the history of professional or British wrestling. So thank you, Stephen Bell, for being today's guest. It's been fascinating to talk to you. I'm so inspired by your writing journey and really excited to see what comes next for you. No, you're more than welcome, Ben. Thank you for having me. And that has flown by, so it must have been an enjoyable chat. That's what we try and do. Well, everyone, if you've liked today's show, then it would be great if you could give us a 5-star rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Don't also forget to let us know what you think via the hashtag GoodJourneysPod. All episodes of the show can be found on our website, which is secondmountaincomms.co.uk/podcast. So that's it for today. I've been Ben Veal. My guest today has been Stephen Bell, the author of Dynamite and Davey. Thank you for joining us today. This has been the Good Journeys with Second Mountain podcast. So until next time, let's keep climbing together, and I'll see you all again soon.